Hi, it's good to welcome everybody here today. I'm Lori Field, President of the League of Women Voters of San Diego. I just wanted to take a moment today to talk about the purpose of this meeting, why we're here, what we do, and kind of give a big, broad overview, and then we'll hand it off to Miles and his team to take us forward. So, as you all know, the League of Women Voters is a 100-year-old organization, and our mission is education and advocacy. Most of you attend our educational events like Lunch with the League or Hot Topic Saturdays. We host a lot of candidate forums during the election cycle as well as ballot reviews. So those are educational opportunities, but we also want to do advocacy as well. And so one of the reasons or one of the ways we do that is through study and consensus that produces positions. So we can only advocate on issues that we have positions on. Today is kind of a hybrid event. It's not a study and it's not a consensus. It's an opportunity for us to pull together some issues and platforms from disparate positions that we already have and see if we can use them to advocate for a position that we don't have a specific platform or issue on. So today we're going to talk about housing and transportation. And as we go through this meeting with Miles and his team, this will all become apparent to you, but it's a very interesting and a fun way to apply league principles, league positions, and league platforms to advocate for positions and issues within our local community. So I'm delighted to have everybody here today. I think this is going to be a really fun and exciting meeting. Miles' team is really prepared to take us through this and involve us all in this. And this is a very interactive opportunity for us today. As you know, this is a grassroots organization, and we look forward to your feedback and have you participate with us in this presentation today. So I'm going to hand it over to Miles in just a second, but I want to take just a second before I do to welcome Carol Moon Goldberg, who is our state league president. She is dropping in with us today. She's going to participate hopefully in some of this and give us some feedback as well. And just enjoy the rest of the meeting. So I'm going to hand it over to Miles now, and he can introduce his team. Thanks, Miles.
Thank you, Lori. I'm Miles Pomeroy. I'm the chair of the Public Policy League for the League of Women Voters of San Diego. And as Lori mentioned, we do have a team of people that I've been working with to develop this presentation, and we'll be developing our housing action policy going forward. So I'd like to introduce our team. First is Jamie Hagee. Jamie is a relatively new league member. She joined our public policy committee several months ago and graciously has offered to work with us on developing our housing action policy. Next, we have Mary Lydon. Mary, can you raise your hand? And Mary is the former executive director of the Urban Land Institute of San Diego. She's also a former member of the City of San Diego Planning Commission. She has 25 years of experience serving as a leader in the civic area and as a housing advocate in San Diego. And she currently has her own consulting business providing services to not-for-profit organizations with a focus on land use. Next, I'd like to introduce Mary Thompson. Mary, can you raise your hand? So Mary is the Civil Engagement Chair for the League of Women Voters of North County, San Diego. And she worked with the San Diego Deliberation Network in 2018 to create a framework for deliberative dialogues on affordable housing issues. And finally, I'd like to introduce Susan Baldwin. Susan. And Susan is a retired city and regional planner who worked at Sandag for 27 years. And while at Sandag, she worked on land use and housing policy issues and prepared 3 regional housing needs assessments. And I'll tell you just a little bit more about myself. I am a retired urban planner with the city of San Diego for 23 years. And while I was there for 13 of those years, I was the city's housing planner. And so I'm familiar with housing policy issues. So I'd like to share the screen with you and show a PowerPoint presentation that we've developed. So we are here today to develop to get input from you on developing a regional housing action policy today. And we have both San Diego leagues participating with us today, the North County League and the San Diego League. So I want to review with you the process for developing a housing action policy. So the Public Policy Committee that I chair worked on doing a lot of research on housing issues for about 1.5 years. And we have put together some questions that we'd like to ask you later in this presentation. Following that, our housing team will meet over a series of meetings that I anticipate will take a month or 2, and we will draft a policy with using the input that we get this morning, and that will be presented to the Public Policy Committee for review, and then we'll be presenting it to the boards of both leagues for adoption. So the goals of a regional housing action policy are to create an applicable integrated platform of league positions which are targeted and address emerging regional housing issues. And we want our housing action policy to be integrated with the goals of sustainability and equity. So our current housing position was created in 1993, but much has changed in the interim. And the league is now moving toward developing action policies in order to integrate new dynamics into our housing position. So what's changed since 1993? And it turns out that a lot has changed. First, we've had steady regional population growth in that time. We now have a major housing crisis, especially with respect to low-income and middle-income housing levels. There's been a steady increase in housing prices. Homelessness has emerged as a major issue, and short-term vacation rental units have emerged as a major issue. At the same time, we've lost as many as 10,000 single room occupancy hotel rooms, and we've lost a large number of other previously existing affordable housing units. So there's a direct relationship between housing and transportation, and this diagram is attempting to show that. The layout of our housing and land use patterns determines transportation. And as you all know, San Diego has a low density suburban form of development that makes automobiles the primary mode of transportation. So we have a suburban auto-centric development pattern, which makes it more difficult to achieve our climate action plan goals, and also impacts our housing affordability because of the spread out nature of the development and low density, which impacts housing costs. So where should we be locating new affordable housing? We think it should be located along transit corridors and near major employment centers. So both leagues adopted a new transportation action policy last month, and our housing action policy is intended to complement that new transportation action policy, and they should both work in tandem to guide league advocacy on housing and transportation issues. So as I said, we do have a housing crisis. Most of our housing is being built for high-income households. Very little is being built for middle, low, and very low-income households. And as an example, housing units built in the city of San Diego in the period between 2010 and 2019 was 43,000. We had 43,000 housing units built, but Sandag's goal for this city was 88,000. So this chart shows that, and I can show you what the numbers are. This chart is comparing the number of construction starts at various income levels in green to our regional housing needs assessment goals as assigned by Sandag, and I'll tell you what those numbers are. When I go to the cursor, it shows that. Well, it should be, but I've got them written down anyhow. So the number for very low income households is about 3,000, but our goal was almost 22,000. For low income, we also produced about 3,000, but our goal was 16,700. In the moderate income, at the moderate income level, you don't see anything because the number is so low. The number was actually 34. There were 34 construction starts for moderate income housing in that period, 2010 to 2019. And our goal was 15,500. The only area in which we have exceeded our goal is the above moderate income level. And for that, we built, we have started 36,500 units, and our goal was 33,900. So overall, as the previous slide shows, we produced about 40, we started about 43,000 units, and our goal was 88,000. So not quite half. So we have developed a number of discussion questions that we'd like to ask the people here this morning. These were developed by the Public Policy Committee to reflect current issues. The questions are intended to stimulate discussion and input. And as Kim explained, we'd like you to comply with Zoom etiquette. Please use the raise your hand feature at the bottom of the screen, or type your questions in chat. And as we go through the questions and we have discussion, I would like to invite our housing experts who are here with us as part of our team to feel free to make comments as you feel appropriate on each specific question. And Kim will be monitoring the raise your hand feature in the chat so that she can call on you. So let's proceed with the questions. And the first one is concerns the use of underutilized publicly owned land. And the question is, should underutilized publicly owned land be used more intensely to help meet affordable housing goals? So on the right side of the screen, we've posed a number of questions that are intended to provoke discussion that relates to that question. The MTS parking lots, for example, some of those MTS parking lots are underutilized, and MTS has developed a policy now for allowing for affordable housing to be built on their underutilized lots. But there are a lot of other public agencies out there who also own land, and should that land also be made available for affordable housing, and should those agencies work jointly with affordable housing developers to produce housing, and should affordable housing developers get first crack at these properties when they're made available? So I'd like to open that up for discussion. I should explain that Jamie is going to be our timekeeper, and will be monitoring the amount of time that we have available for each question. So Jamie, we don't want this to go more than an hour and a half. So in order for us to finish on time, how much time do we have to spend on each question?
We have about 10 minutes total. That will leave us with 7 minutes at the end of the meeting.
Okay. Okay, so let's open this up for this particular question up for discussion and see what people think. And Kim will be calling on folks.
As Ted Kagan wrote in the chat, absolutely yes on all items.
Okay.
I don't see any hands raised. Okay, Jane Andrews.
What are the problems with this policy? Why would anybody be opposed to it, and why hasn't it happened so far?
I would say that it hasn't happened more than with respect to MTS. And MTS policy was only recently developed last year after Circulate San Diego did a study of the usage of MTS parking lots to indicate that a number of them were underutilized. And I think the other public agencies perhaps have not prioritized affordable housing as much as they could be, and or have not gone through a deliberative process to identify land that might be surplus and made available for other uses.
Mary had raised her hand. Mary Thompson.
I did. Just to try and bring a possible contrary view to this would be if you are an agency, or you may have in your guidelines, your bylaws, whatever, have language that dedicates the land or dedicates assets, and it would need an agreement by that agency or organization to definitively say, yes, we want to do this. So not so that, and again, I know the words are public land here, but so we don't get into the territory of a taking.
Do you mean eminent domain, Mary? Is that what you're referencing here?
Exactly.
Okay, Beryl had a question as well.
Well, first of all, the land is part of the assets that these groups have. And the question is, should they turn that over to affordable housing, or should they save it for something else? And I mean, MTS is one thing, but school districts is another. Secondly, I would change should to could, so that it's sort of more flexible.
Okay, Mary Lydon is next.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment, and Beryl just referred to the school district. First of all, MTS is really, they've taken a lead as a public agency of opening up these parking lots, these underutilized parking lots. They're setting a model for other public agencies to take a look at their underutilized or excess land. The school district has a lot of excess land, and they have not redeveloped any of that land, although in the last 10 years, they've had a couple of sites that they've experimented with where they're in partnership using their land on a long-term lease with developers who have put affordable housing on that land. So I think we may see this emerging as more of a tool, especially if the public and groups like League of Women Voters express our desire for public agencies to review their land and see what are the appropriate excess land to put out there for housing use.
Susan Baldwin.
I was just going to add that I think one other thing that probably keeps this from happening is the desire for the public agencies, if they are going to sell the land, to make the most amount of money that they can from selling it. So they might not be able to make as much money on the property if it's set aside for affordable housing or parks or other public benefits.
Jamie?
Thank you. And I actually think we should keep the term should, because just going off of what Susan said about selling the land, there's also the law, the companies can actually buy out of the low income as building low income. And so I think that we're at the point that we need to, it needs to be should, not could.
I would also like to bring up that the school districts, sometimes they're leasing the land for 66 years. So, I mean, is that really, that's not a permanent solution. And does that even make sense to build a building and then tear it down 66 years later? Jane Andrews is next.
I was also wondering if publicly owned land includes military owned land. And I'm thinking, especially of some of those Navy buildings near Old Town, you know, that's a prime corridor. Do you have that in mind too?
That's federally owned land.
Okay, so military is not public. Okay. All right. Thank you.
I did want to make one comment about that, though, and Jamie might have some thoughts on that too, as a military employee. Jane, you mentioned the military-owned land in Old Town, and the military is working with Sandag to redevelop part of that area, or at least to create a potential concept plan to use part of that land as a Grand Central station as part of their regional transportation plan. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah.
Jamie, do you have any additional thoughts on this?
Susan has her hand up.
I'm not sure. To me, I think federally owned land and military land is public land, but it would have to go through a process to use it for something other than military land. So, I mean, I think it's less likely to be used for affordable housing, but you know, for example, Liberty Station, when the city ended up planning for that land, I believe, I think some of the land was used for military housing. I'm not absolutely sure, but
You're right.
They could have required that the housing that was built by the private sector on that land have a certain percentage as affordable. I don't remember enough about the process, whether that was even considered, but.
I mean, once you sell it, it's up to the builders and what they are doing. There is some military housing there that's outside of the base, but it just kind of looks like the blocked off area across the restaurants and stuff like that. That is designated for mainly the enlisted, so that kind of goes into your low income people. But if you're talking about the nicer homes, those are still $1 million homes.
Yeah.
Okay, Ann Olmsted has had her hand raised, and then I do want to know the time as well.
I would
ahead,
just
Ann.
hi, I would like to point out that in Camp Pendleton and in parts of San Diego, the military have used their property to house their own people. And that actually would be a contribution to solving some of the lower income housing if they would focus not on the officers, but the lower military grades. So that's not necessarily an area that we would have to focus on. We could encourage them to build for their people.
Jamie, what do we want to do about the time?
I was just going to mention that we're over by 1 minute.
Okay.
Susan
Can I
does
just
have
add one thing? I just want to point out that the sports arena property, that's publicly owned land. And in my opinion, that should have a hefty requirement for affordable housing on it when it gets developed. So just putting that out there. Thanks.
Okay.
And I just want to put out one thing about military housing. Majority of it is for enlisted, it is not for officers. And actually, a lot of it is screened as well too, as far as what you're applying for as well. So the military is trying to take care of its more lower income people. But then also you have the choice of not having to live. They once they are married, enlisted are not required to live on base anymore once they get past E3.
I just want to take a moment to kind of bring us back to the purview of our question regarding like our local situation. So as Miles pointed out, and we mentioned at the beginning of this, we're looking at this in terms of the League of Women Voters San Diego and the North County League together. And Carol, our state president, pointed out in the chat, I don't know if you guys have noticed, but you know, some of the issues that exceed our purview, we don't really have an opportunity to educate. So as she pointed out, military land is a federal issue, and that would need to be worked on at the national level of the LWVUS. So some of these questions we just need to remember that we're talking about them in terms of what we can actually take action on locally.
Okay, so let's move on to the next question. And that has to do with where should we focus future housing, and should it be focused primarily along transit corridors and near transit stops? Does it make sense to do this? Should it also be focused near employment centers? And does it make sense to establish affordable housing goals for all of San Diego's communities?
One thing I would ask real quickly is, when you say transit corridors and transit stops, does that mean existing ones that are in service today or ones that are planned that are supposedly going to open 8 years from now?
Both. We're developing a housing policy, housing action policy, which should be in effect for a number of years. So we need to be looking into the future as well as the present situation.
It just seems like sometimes they pencil out what they might be planning for transit way in the future, and sometimes it doesn't get built.
Well, but at some point, a plan is going to be adopted. I think with respect to future plans, it would be best to focus on future trolley stations if we're talking about near transit stops, because bus lines are much easier to change than trolley stations. And also, Sandag is working on their regional transportation plan now, which could introduce potentially some elements of heavy rail that we don't have right now, except for the coaster and the sprinter that runs from Oceanside to Escondido. So there could be potentially more lines of that type too, as well as expanded trolley.
Mary Thompson?
I want to point out the whole dilemma of if you build it, they will come. And that is, most of our land in regional is up in the North County and East County. And so thinking far into the future, that dilemma of, preparing ourselves for that future and planning for that. And I know there's many issues regarding this, the regional planning and so forth, wildfire mitigation, all of those things. But just thinking of what do we have to work with, our land is up north and inland.
Mary Lydon?
Yeah, there's definitely, this would be a good conversation with the group that's here today. there's definitely push and pull on this issue between North County and South County, San Diego. The North County a lot of times want our San Diego dollars, our transit dollars to go towards highways. And in South County, there's more of a proclivity for transit-oriented spending of those transit dollars. So, this would be a good one to find some kind of common ground between our two groups related to this issue.
Jean Nelson? You'll have to unmute.
Right. Okay. Talking about the future, if we don't plan for the future, something else will be accomplished and we won't even have any input. We have to be talking about future.
I just wondered if there was something where you could specify, like if this transit line is in the plans, in a certain plan that we know it's going to be built in the next 10 years, fine. If it's just a pipe dream for 40 years from now, then maybe not so much.
Well, that's true too.
I think
Susan Baldwin?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to point out that the Sprinter line, which is North County, Oceanside to Escondido, has 15 stations, and those are all opportunities for transit-oriented development. And there have been studies done by NCTD, the North County Transit District, relating to development. In particular, this was a while back in Oceanside, Escondido, and Carlsbad. So there are opportunities for transit-oriented development in North County as well.
I want to interject just really quickly regarding this question, because I think there's an implicit assumption here that transit corridors and transit stops will be planned within employment centers. I think that's one of the reasons the questions on the right are relevant, and we need to kind of keep that in our minds as we kind of try to think forward about what this is going to look like, because as we were discussing, a lot of the land that's north of us might ultimately be turned into employment centers, and years from now it might be viewed as an opportunity to build transit to centers that may not even really exist right now.
Thanks, Lori. Peg Engel is next.
Thanks. I just have a question about the third question down on the right. What we're thinking about there exactly? Are we talking about like a county level agency?
No, there's been some consideration. In fact, the city council, I believe now, has asked the planning department for the city of San Diego to do some preliminary work on identifying affordable housing goals for individual San Diego communities that could become incorporated into the city's housing element. So we're not talking about a separate agency. We're talking about establishing numerical goals for housing in San Diego communities, with the recognition that this is a citywide issue and that we need more housing in all of our communities, and particularly affordable housing.
Jane Andrews.
Thank you. I wanted to focus on that third question too, because I am very much for establishing some real, numbers for the whole region to strive for housing goals, because I think if there aren't numbers, it becomes very vague. And I come from Massachusetts, where there were some state guidelines that people really had to follow, and it was what made things work. So, but I wanted to ask, with the Sandag effort with regional housing, would it be possible to sort of add an affordable component to what Sandag is doing? Is that what we're striving for?
Susan might want to comment on that.
Yeah, so the regional housing needs assessment that in my intro that Miles read, that Sandag does for every housing element cycle, every city has to have a general plan, and every city has to have a housing element of that general plan. And that's done now every 8 years. And the regional housing needs assessment that Sandag does is it gets a number from the state that is broken down into 4 income categories: very low, low, moderate, and above moderate. And those numbers get assigned to every jurisdiction. And that's the preliminary step before they do their housing elements. And so each jurisdiction has goals for very low, low, moderate, and above moderate. And the main focus of those goals is the very low and low, and making sure that every jurisdiction has multifamily zoned land to take care of their low income needs. So that does not equate to affordability, but it sets the stage for allowing affordable housing to be built using either inclusionary requirements, regulatory requirements at the local level, or to use funding sources like low income tax credits or state bond money. Thanks.
And are we looking for the league to be able to kind of push that process along, advocate?
Well, a place the league could advocate is at the local level, is making sure the housing elements get done properly and giving input on those housing elements as they're developed, because they have to show what their programs are and how they've zoned enough land to take care of their regional housing needs assessment goals.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Jamie, you put the 1-minute warning in the chat. Did you want to say anything else?
Yes, I do have in regards to future housing, I am aware that companies can actually buy out of not having to build any kind of affordable housing. I would like to say that we need to add that you can't buy out of a certain number.
We have a
Okay,
question
Mary
that relates to that also.
Yeah, also, I'm afraid that we are at the end of this for this question. We can either push forward and then reduce another question. Otherwise, we need to continue on.
Okay.
Let's let Mary Lydon speak.
I forgot what I lost track. There were so many interesting comments, so I'm going to pass.
Okay, shall we move on?
Yes.
Okay. So our next question, actually, this is a perfect lead-in to the comment that Jamie just made, and it has to do with inclusionary housing in lieu fees. And so our question is, should inclusionary housing in lieu fees be structured to encourage on-site affordable housing, or to allow developers to pay them to the Housing Commission for use in buying or rehabilitating other affordable housing? So just to explain what inclusionary housing is and what in lieu fees are, inclusionary housing requires that a project have a specified percentage of housing be set aside as affordable. And in lieu fees allow developers to pay a fee instead of actually building the units. That's what Jamie was referring to a second ago. So does on-site affordable housing promote desegregation and mixed income communities? Some of the on-site housing might be in expensive neighborhoods, which would require more public subsidy because the land is more expensive. Would this be a good use of public dollars? And should fees be used to help preserve other affordable housing, which might otherwise be at risk of converting to market rate, or should the fees be used to actually build new housing. So those are some provocative questions that we'd like to ask you to think about as you respond to this.
Are you able to unmute? Go ahead.
I think that the inclusionary housing fees need to be an appropriate dollar amount to actually build affordable housing. You often hear, particularly the public decision makers who discuss these items, seem to be very surprised at the cost of building affordable housing. And that lack of knowledge on their part encourages them to establish an in lieu fee that is reasonable for developers to pay. And by incorporating that sense of reasonableness, they end up with way too little money to actually produce an affordable unit, even if that affordable unit were to be constructed in a multifamily multifamily building that may not be in quite as a high cost neighborhood or high cost style of construction. So I think couple things where the league's policies could be very helpful to decision makers in our communities is information about what a reasonable in lieu fee would be. Reasonable meaning not what developers want to afford, but reasonable being what does it really cost to build this unit. And the other thing is the higher that is, the in lieu fee is, the more it does encourage the developer to include the affordable units within a multifamily project rather than paying this fee into a fund. And I think that the more those units are actually built, it does promote desegregation in mixed income communities that I think helps the future success of those developments and the communities where they reside.
Thank you. Susan Baldwin.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Pam. I think that you made some great points. I also want to suggest that that I believe that when inclusionary ordinances are adopted, that there should be a requirement to build if the project is of a certain size. Now, what that size is debatable, 50 units, 100 units. But I think that to create more balanced communities, which is in the city of San Diego, one of the general plan goals, that projects of a certain size should be building those units.
We might be able to make up some time on this one.
How do people feel about about addressing the last point? To what extent should fees be used to help preserve other affordable housing that might be at risk of converting to market rate, or should those fees be used to build new housing?
Pamela Willis.
Personally, I think the fees should be used to build new housing because, as your previous slides demonstrated, there's a huge need for new housing or additional housing in the low and very low income categories. I think, though, that this question is very relevant right now because a lot of the affordable housing that currently exists was built during the time when cities had redevelopment agencies, and the redevelopment laws required those units to be built, but their affordability periods started out at only about 30 years. Ultimately, by the demise of redevelopment, they were extended to about 55 years. But as time goes on, we're reaching the end of some of those covenants. And I think it's a very real issue that you bring up about how the affordability covenants that exist are going to expire. And there's a real question about how can those be extended. It's basically potentially going to require another big pot of money.
Mhm. Are we ready to move on?
Sorry,
next-
Jane, I was trying to call
Okay.
on Jane, but I was
I
muted.
have just a quick comment. I think that the fees should be used to maintain housing that's affordable. Obviously, it depends on the housing, but I've been reading a lot lately about naturally occurring affordable housing, NOAH funds. And I think if there is housing that is, going to last for a good many years that is still affordable, that the funds should go to that. So I would say yes on the last one.
And Susan.
I just wanted to add one other thing that might be considered as part of this discussion or as part of a policy would be to require when these inclusionary units are built that they be designated as affordable in perpetuity instead of having a 20-year or 50-year time frame.
Absolutely, that's a very important point.
Kathy O'Leary Carey. You'll have to unmute. There you go.
Yeah. Yes, I agree with Susan because that would certainly provide more housing for people, especially if we're going. I'm happy to hear that there'll be more available, and it would be wonderful if that could. I agree what she said about that. It would certainly give us more housing for the need that we have, and I'm particularly concerned about the moderate income, moderate housing being very low. I thought it was just the low housing, so that was a real surprise to me to find out that the moderate housing was also very low.
Susan?
Yeah, I think one thing that also maybe should be considered is having inclusionary ordinances require a percentage of moderate income housing that is restricted in cost into the future, because there aren't very many programs for moderate income housing. And I believe that when housing is built that is, moderate and there are no price controls on it, that if housing prices are rising, those units do not stay affordable. They may be affordable, for ownership initially, but the rents can go up. People can flip the houses for a lot of money if they are not restricted as the very low and low income units tend to be.
Right.
Okay, and we're out of time.
Okay. The next question has to do with mixed income communities. Should they be encouraged in order to promote social and economic integration? but might it also promote social divisiveness, i.e. NIMBYism? And if it does make sense to encourage mixed income communities, what incentives might be provided to encourage communities to accept them?
So would this apply both to existing communities that are at one end of the spectrum being open to allowing in the other parts, and also to brand new developments?
Yes. We're really talking about communities in San Diego that are broader than individual projects. We're talking about communities as a whole, such as La Jolla, Carmel Valley, and also the older communities, North Park, Uptown, etc., as opposed to individual projects.
That makes sense. Susan?
Well, I think the older communities generally are mixed income because a lot of them in the mid-city area where I live, there were many apartments that were built in the 60s and 70s. They're called Huffmans, and those tend to be affordable still and naturally occurring affordable housing. And those units are potentially at risk because they may be redeveloped in the future. So that's an interesting issue to contemplate. And then I just wanted to point out that when the Pacific Highlands Ranch and the areas around 56 were developed, they were called the future urbanizing area, that the city required that 20% of the units built, and they had to build them, be affordable to low-income households. So there was a requirement, there is, and because I don't think they're completely finished building up there yet, but there was a requirement to do that in a brand new community, and it's been very successful. So just wanted to point that out.
Margie Larson? You should be able to unmute.
I think it's very important that we do have mixed communities, because wealthy people sometimes don't understand people that are in poverty. And we have too many houses that are built, or low-income houses built all in one area. And when you see, they're just people and they can help each other. I didn't, until I got to know some people that didn't have a car and couldn't drive, I realized how important transportation is, because we just jump in a car and go there. So I wanted to say I'm against inclusionary housing. Instead of having an in lieu fee, I think they should insist that they provide it. And then people get to see, when they get to know people, that they want to help. So.
Beryl?
Well, I think we should get rid of the zoning for single family housing and open it up to townhouses or small apartment buildings throughout the city.
Mary Thompson?
Well, when I think about a social good and what incentives might be offered, when you think of planning a region, what kind of region do we want? Do we want integrated communities? Do we want, and what tools do we have to promote that? And I'm thinking lower tax rates for existing areas that you're trying to promote into mixed income, or other amenities brought into the area that agrees to allow this mixed. So it's sort of a carrot and stick sort of thing, but the agency has the power, and it's the decision to use it toward a goal that we might all agree on, meaning a more integrated society.
Kathy?
I would say that, I would say that should mixed communities, income communities be encouraged? I think the answer should be yes, period.
Mary Lydon?
Yeah, I wanted to ask Mary T, as I call her, if she knows of any cities who have an incentive, a tax incentive for mixed income communities. It's a very interesting idea. No? Okay. All right.
No.
Thanks, Mary. We'll have to do some research.
Jane wrote in the chat, will we discuss zoning?
Zoning is not a specific question, but it certainly relates to what we're talking about. And as Burl just mentioned, she thinks that we should be eliminating single family zoning. So if you have a comment, Jane, on zoning, please feel free to express it.
Susan?
Well, I was just going to say with respect to zoning, and Jane may want to ask her question, but I just wanted to mention that that the housing element process is actually basically requires cities to zone for multifamily housing, because they have to zone for multifamily housing to show that they have sites for very low and low income units to be built. So from that standpoint, zoning is a part of the housing element general plan process.
And I might elaborate on that. The housing element law requires cities to demonstrate that they have sufficient land zoned for multifamily to meet all of their RHNA goals in every income category. And if they don't, then they are expected to do some rezoning so that they do have sufficient land set aside in all zones to meet their regional housing needs assessment goals.
In this region, all the cities, because through the last housing element cycle and even the previous one, to meet their RHNA goals, a lot of them rezoned around transit stations. So a lot of that has already happened. The question is, is it getting built? And in some cases, yes, and in some cases, no.
Jane, did you want to say something?
I'll just have a follow-up. So for you all who are in the know, do you feel that the region or the city has done enough with zoning changes? I mean, I hear there's enforcement, of course, but I'm just aware that the city of Minneapolis eliminated single-family zoning, on a more broad scale basis. Do you think that's not realistic for San Diego?
Well, if I could jump in, Minneapolis is a trailblazer. Yeah. And I think other cities are going to watch to see what happens and how it works. Mm-hmm. And cities do copy other cities when things are working. And when they're not working, we don't copy them. So I think, Susan may have more to say on that, but I think we will watch carefully what's going to happen in Minneapolis.
Yeah, I wasn't going to opine on the single family housing issue, but I do want to point out that the city, the region as a whole has a lot of multifamily zoned land. Much of it is land that would be redeveloped. It's not vacant land. In some cases it is vacant land, but not all cases. And the city of San Diego specifically, in their housing element that is now sitting at the state waiting for approval, they pointed out that they have through community plan amendments over the past 6 years in 14 communities, they've added 74,000 units of capacity. And I believe probably most, if not all of that capacity is multifamily capacity. So there's a lot of multifamily, there's a lot of areas that could be built as multifamily.
Okay, I know we're out of time, but Jean Nelson has had her hand up for quite a while.
I was just going to say, probably this is very well known, but as far as incentives go, to include common areas or additions to existing common areas like parks or even school improvements.
And then Miles, I don't, Lisa Thode wrote a question about COVID in the chat. I don't know what you want to do with that time-wise, because I know we need to move on.
Yeah.
Is there time at the end, maybe?
Yeah.
No time at the end.
Let's try to do that. Let's try to accommodate her at
Okay,
the end.
we're down to only having 6 minutes for the next 3 questions, and there's no extra time at the end.
Yikes. All right.
Jamie's
Let's move
telling us,
fast. So the next question has to do with tenant protections. Should the league support tenant protections? And there are a number of aspects to the issue, including displacement and gentrification, landlord-tenant disputes, and long-term retention of renters in communities undergoing gentrification.
We might need some clarification on what tenant protections in particular are. That's a really broad statement.
Yeah.
Well, are you talking about eviction protection specifically, or the question overall?
Question overall, I appreciate your bullet points to the right, because those do help kind of take us to a particular place of thought. But the question in general is very, very broad.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at it in terms of advocacy, standing in front of the city council or board of supervisors. That's
well, there are a number of different aspects to it, and we typically think of it in terms of eviction protection, and we see that right now with COVID. That's a major issue, but there are other aspects to it as well that have a longer term focus. And to what extent should the league be addressing all of these aspects of tenant protections in our housing action policy?
Mary Thompson?
Right, just to bring a bit of a contrary view to this, and we're seeing it in this very moment with COVID, to Meg and Lisa's point, which is as we're grappling at a state level right now, and even a national level about evictions and how should we deal with this, the contrary view is, and keeping landlords whole. Most landlords, many landlords are mom and pop kind of operations and can't bankroll lots and lots of non-payment. And so keeping that in mind, whatever we do, it's got to be equitable for both landlord and tenant.
Well said, Mary. It's a complex issue, you're right. And it involves more than tenants, because landlords have to pay their mortgages too.
Okay, Jamie's telling us we've got 3 minutes left, but I don't see any hands.
Okay, let's move on to the next one real quick then.
Okay.
So should additional affordable housing be built to meet our needs? San Diego has a major affordable housing crisis. Our costs continue to increase, and the gap between income and housing costs continue to widen.
Isn't there a mandate on this as well, Miles, from the state as far as building affordable housing in particular areas throughout the state?
There is, the state has tried to make it a requirement through the housing element law, but the enforcement mechanism has been uneven. Governor Newsom has begun to, well, he said that when he took office, that he was going to place more emphasis on this, but it hasn't happened in the last year or so because of COVID. He's been preoccupied with that and enforcing housing element requirements to actually get the housing built has taken a back seat to everything else now.
Susan?
Well, I just want to point out that I think housing element law, although it is shifting towards actual production, its history has been more about zoning and providing opportunities for, providing adequate sites as opposed to actual construction of units. And really, the only way we're going to get affordable housing built is through regulatory measures, at least in my opinion, regulatory measures like inclusionary or density bonus laws, allowing accessory dwelling units, and also funding for subsidizing affordable housing, whether it be federal programs, state programs, or local programs. So, the housing element law itself hasn't really, is still really not oriented towards as much as it could be towards building. And the state, I don't know if they're still doing this, but they used to require, when a housing element was done, that the city, if they had an inclusionary ordinance, that the city analyze it as a barrier to affordable housing. I don't know if that's still the case, but that's something to consider.
Shall we move
Leiden?
on to the next question real fast? How much time do we have left?
Mary has a quick comment to throw in before we move on.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to throw in something that's emerging across the state, and I'm actually, one of my clients is focused on this, and that's building affordable housing on excess land that is owned by faith-based entities. There's 44,000 acres of faith-based owned land in the state of California. And a lot of it is zoned for residential, not necessarily multifamily residential. But faith-based entities, they have a mission to serve their communities, to serve their congregation. And this concept is very interesting to them. We had a Senate bill make its way through the legislature last year, 899, but it got pulled at the last moment. And it is working its way back up again to be reintroduced this legislative session. So this could be a really interesting part of the solution. If we could use that nonprofit land that doesn't have to pay property taxes, that really helps significantly lower the cost per unit of building homes on faith-based land. So that was just an idea to throw out there. If you hear of that, do what you can to help make it move forward.
Okay, and time to move on.
Thank you. Okay, so I believe this is our last question, and it has to do with preservation of existing affordable housing. And we've already talked about this a bit. So how can existing affordable housing be preserved over the long term? And as Jane Andrews mentioned, there are a number of naturally occurring affordable housing units that are being lost to redevelopment by higher priced units. And there are also a number of rent restricted units that are legally at risk of converting to market rate as their rent restrictions expire. And Pam Willis brought up that point earlier in her comments.
I think another item to add to this discussion might be the conversion of a lot of the hotels that used to provide single room occupancy, and
Yes.
those opportunities for people who were homeless or, you know, perhaps in danger of becoming homeless. So that has actually been a part of this problem as well. Isn't that correct, Miles?
Right. I mentioned that earlier when we were reviewing what's changed since 1993, and we've lost as many as 10,000 of those older SRO hotel rooms. Many of those were in the downtown area and were converted to market rate housing or other uses.
Pam Willis?
Does anyone know what would be the viability of creating new SRO units? I'm aware that they provided housing for certain segment of the population who was very well served by that, lived very amicably in those almost like group settings with sufficient privacy. And I think that's one area that could be encouraged to build more buildings that operate in that style, since we certainly have lost a lot of those downtown with gentrification and development into condos and higher priced full apartments. And I'm just wondering if there's any effort to try to recreate some SRO style living situations.
That's a great comment, Pam. Thank you for making that. And I do know that the Housing Commission is looking at that. And as our housing team meets over the next several weeks to actually draft our housing action policy, we will be looking at that in more depth. So I really appreciate your making that comment.
Susan?
I just wanted to add one thing about the at-risk units. The city of San Diego lost in housing elements. That's a requirement that cities have to identify units at risk in the future 10-year period that could lose their affordability. And the city, so that's codified in the housing elements that are put together. But then the question becomes, is anyone paying any attention to the potential loss of those units once they've been identified? And there was a project in San Diego called Penasquitos Village, where that actually, those units were lost because no one was paying attention. But the good news is that I think that experience caused the city of San Diego Housing Commission to hire someone who would actually be much more proactively following those units, looking at those units, so that that kind of situation doesn't happen again. Of course, you have to have resources to support the continuance of those affordable units or the affordability of those units. But if you aren't paying attention, it's easy to lose them. So I just wanted to point out that just identifying them isn't enough. You have to actually try to preserve them.
And I just wanted to point. Go ahead, Mary T. Sorry.
I could see a convergence of some of the ideas I've heard here this morning. For example, from Meg and Lisa Thode, and Pam's idea, and even Lori Thiel's idea, which is, you know, we've through COVID watched many people that have gotten out of homelessness and at this city's expense put into a hotel. What if those hotel rooms were then ultimately sold back into the private sector as SROs, and sort of this melding of opportunities, the silver lining department?
Okay, we're down to 1 minute left.
Okay, I guess this may be our final comment on this. I just wanted to point out that last year, the Housing Commission did what I thought was a really good study on this topic, how to preserve existing affordable housing. They made a number of great recommendations, and our team will be taking a look at those as we meet to develop our policy. So just to wrap up, again, I want to emphasize where we are in the process right now. And we're at step 2 on this graphic where we're meeting with you this morning. So our next step will be to our housing action policy team will actually be drafting the policy. We'll be presenting that to the Public Policy Committee for review, and then to the boards of both leagues for adoption. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go back to our overall view. And I wanted to thank everybody for participating today. I think we had some great comments, great discussion, and I think it'll really help our team in coming up with a solid, comprehensive action policy. So thank everybody very much.
Thank you, Miles, and your entire team there. It was really, those were very thoughtful questions that you posed for us all, and it was a really good opportunity for us to kind of get a sense of where your team was going and some of the direction that you wanted to take. As Miles said, the wrap-up requires them to pull together some of the feedback they got here today and kind of come up with an actual policy that they can produce and provide to the 2 boards. And Olmsted and I will review that afterwards, and then we'll just keep in touch with the membership and let everyone know like what the final outcome was of that. I would like to provide people opportunities to follow up with you, Miles. If anybody has any questions that they'd like to submit to you, can we just put your email in the chat just in case people leave here today and like have some more feedback for some of the information you shared?
Yeah, I'll type it right now.
Okay, and as Kim said earlier, we are going to send out an evaluation following this meeting, and perhaps we'll also provide that information that Miles is giving you in the chat, so that anybody who is on here who wants to submit questions or comment ultimately before this goes forward, you can provide that in the information we give you. So Kim, anything else you want to throw in before we wrap this up?
No, I think that's it. Miles has put his email address in the chat, and I put the survey link in the chat. We can follow up by emailing those to everyone as well.
And we have this, we've recorded this, and we're going to post that for your review as well. If any of you have any questions that you want to review and look back through the comments, etc. So that will be available as well, and we'll provide that information and that link too.
And I also wanted to thank our housing team. I think all of you made some great comments, and I want to applaud all of you for that. Thank you. And I'll be in touch with you to schedule our first meeting to begin to actually do the hard work of writing it.
Great. All right. Well, thank you.
Thanks again, everybody.
Mary, Jamie, Susan, and Kim for another great presentation and meeting. And go enjoy the rest of your Saturday, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.